Hello and welcome to the King's Indian Defense Classical with Knight to E1. This is chapter number 1 of my entire King's Indian Defense Masterclass, and this is potentially the most important chapter because firstly, it's the main line of the classical of the King's Indian, and second of all, I think it really shows on a fundamental level what the King's Indian is all about, because as you're going to see many times in the video today, black is going to get a very deadly king side attack and white is going to go for one on the queen side. So this is like the true essence of the King's Indian. So in the video today, as always, we're going to be discussing all of the main lines that you need to know starting from this position after knight e1. There's also going to be a PGN file in the description that you can check out the theory and the game examples that I'm going to show for yourselves if you're interested. So let's go ahead and begin now, and I'm going to back up for a second just to kind of show you how this position even gets on the board. So we have the King's Indian setup, right? We play like this. Now the classical variation that white goes for is knight f3. We're going to castle and bishop e2. Now, this could be a good moment to just kind of briefly explain why bishop e2 is far more common than bishop d3. The reason is that after bishop d3, there's a couple of issues. Namely, this pawn here becomes very weak because this knight can be pinned. We go bishop g4. We pin this knight. This pawn becomes very weak and it becomes a big target because the queen no longer defends, the knight no longer defends, and there's actually quite a lot of very nice tactics that can occur from this position, and I'll just show you one on the board right now. If they go h3, kicking away your bishop, we go knight d7. We're adding more pressure to the pawn that I said is a weakness, and if they try to naturally defend, guess what? Knight e5, and we're already winning. We sack a piece, but we're going to win back the material with interest. So I got a little sidetracked there, but that was just quickly and briefly to show the rationale behind the move bishop e2. It's a very safe and consolidating move. You want to castle next. Now, we continue here by going e5. And we're going to look at, obviously, the alternatives that white has in future videos, but today we're concerning ourselves with castles, which is the main line. We go knight c6. We're adding a lot of pressure to the center, so they're very much encouraged to push and close the center. We go knight e7, and here we get a very important main position of the King's Indian, where white needs to make a choice. Now, because we're getting very quick play with the move f5 coming up, white's best shot is to try to get as much counterplay as they can on the queen side as quickly as possible. So there's 3 moves with the aim of achieving this. There's the very direct bayonet with b4. We're going to cover this in the next chapter. Today we're looking at knight e1, and the point of this move is twofold. First of all, we want to meet f5 as white with the move f3, which will secure the center a little and also give this king a little bit of breathing room. And also the bishop often, as you'll see, ends up landing and sitting on f2. So the move f3 is a very important move for white to get in. And in fact, I'll just show you the setup that often happens. We have f5, f3, f4, and the bishop ends up on f2. And this is sort of the setup that white goes for with the move knight e1, where they're trying to aim their bishop on the queen side while also supporting some defense on the king side. So that's part of the move knight e1. The other point, of course, is to just transport the knight at some point to aid in this attack on the queen side. Now, I should also note that there's a couple of different setups that white might be going for with the move knight e1. The main setup is the one I just showed, where they're going for f3 and bishop f2, but the alternative that they have, which I will also show in this video, of course, is for them to not place the bishop on e3, but rather place a setup where the bishop comes to d2. And the point of this move, again, there's a couple of ideas. One is that the bishop sometimes activates along this diagonal and puts pressure along this d6 pawn, which, as you'll see, sometimes is a big weakness. Another point is that, white isn't wasting as much time tucking away the bishop down here. We're not giving black the tempo of hitting the bishop. So those are the 2 main setups, right? There's the setup of bishop e3, bishop f2. This is what we'll start by covering. This is the main line. And then there's the setup of knight to d3, bishop d2. The final thing that we'll talk about in this video is an alternative which is not common, but is something that can be quite surprising if you're not familiar with it, which is this crazy move here, g4. We'll get to this later. It's a very interesting position that will arise, but we'll talk about it towards the end of the video. So let's begin now with the main setup that white has of bishop e3. So we went knight d7. Again, our intention is clear. We want to go f5 and then at some point return the knight back to f6. The reason, by the way, that d7 tends to be a bit better than e8 is that on d7, it's also halting a little white's counterplay on the queen side, making, the breakthrough of c5 a little bit more difficult to actually pull off. So f5 is the next move that we're going to play really regardless of what white goes for. f5, we're expanding and launching our attack. They go f3 again. This is the setup that is, basically exclusively played when the bishop comes to e3, because otherwise we're threatening to just trap the bishop. So they're having, to waste this time bringing the bishop back to f2. And now how do we proceed? Well, very logical. As I mentioned, we go for a kingside attack. So g5. In these sort of structures, it is most effective to push your pawns up to h5 to g5 to f4 and follow up with your pieces. So mostly you start with the pawn and they kind of pave the way forward for your other pieces. So what options exist in this position for white? There's two main ways for white to go about their counterplay on the queen side. There's kind of a typical way, which could look, a million different ways. That could be a3, b4. That could be, playing a move like rook c1 and then continuing with b4, c5. That could be playing knight d3, which is the way that I'm going to show this. So it's basically them doing anything that kind of helps their attack. The other option they have is a sacrificial idea, which is to go rook to c1 and actually give away this pawn. It's a very interesting line. We'll look at it later, but let's begin with the main option of white basically just proceeding by launching an attack on the queen side. Their knight will support this breakthrough with c5. We bring the knight to g6, very logical. We also want to bring the other knight to f6 and again continue and proceed with our attack. Now, this is also something quite instructive. The knight here on d7, we can kind of keep it there until they play c5, because until they do so, this knight is kind of stopping that, and it's making c5 very difficult to pull off. But once they get enough resources to go for it, that's kind of our sign, okay, the knight did its purpose, it kind of stopped the attack for a little, let's bring it back into our own attack. Now, admittedly, at first glance, these sort of positions look scary, which is why you need to be very precise in the way that you go about the balance of defending on the queen side and attacking on the king side. And the move rook f7 is a beautiful way to do that, because the rook guards over the 7th rank and stops some of the ideas that white has with attacking c7, for example, but it also aims to swing over to one of these files that will inevitably, or at least often, open up and then be a great attacking piece. So this is sort of the idea with this move rook f7, very, very strong strategical idea. So in this position, king h1 was playing. I should mention this is now going to be following a game of Hikaru Nakamura with the black side playing against Wesley So. This was in 2015, but this game really shows some of the methods in which we go about attacking. Now here comes another very common motif that you'll see, this expansion of b5. Now this kind of looks weird, because aren't we going for the attack on the king side? Why are we messing around with the queen side moves? Well, b5 is not an attacking move, it's actually a defensive one. Here's the point. The knight, we don't want it to come to c4. Once it reaches c4, it would have come to b6, it would have, put pressure on d6. So b5 is very much a defensive move, a very strong one that stops the attacking resources that were at white's disposal. And, from this point on, both players are continuing with their plan. White is going for an attack on the queen side, putting up their pieces here, and we're starting to continue to launch. You can see that the knights and the bishop support this pawn maneuver up. White is continuing ruthlessly to just bring their pieces into the game. Visually, again, this looks very strong, but objectively, it's not very strong. The engine currently gives this actually an advantage for black, and that's kind of where the idea that looks can be deceiving really comes into play, and you're going to see this a lot. It looks scary, but you just have to realize that at the very worst, you're going to lose a couple pawns here. But your attack here, that could be deadly. That could be checkmate. And this is actually exactly what you'll end up seeing here. There was, a launch here, h4, continuing to push. One idea is to go h3 here and to take on f3 and, open up the position, get the rook in. So in this position, white decided to try to relinquish the pressure by taking. But now f3 comes, a nice sacrifice, preparing a nice knight sack as well. You cannot take, because after rook check, if you take, queen f1, mate. If you move, bishop to e3, a slow but very deadly move. You'll actually see this in the game in a little bit more moves. There we go, bishop e3. It's very dangerous, the position that arises. And, you know, white put really good defensive pressure, and they managed to hold for as much as they could, but eventually, through some nice mating ideas, black ended up winning. So this was a nice illustration of the balance between, you know, defending with the move b5 here and attacking very strategically. h5, g5, get the knights in and get the rook to have the ability to enter the game if it needs to have that ability. Now, before we move on to the second main setup that white has in this classical knight e1 setup, I want to first discuss a sacrifice that is kind of interesting. It happens quite a lot. Again, if white goes for just natural attacking moves, we're going for the same thing that I just showed you, h5, g4, boom. If white, though, plays the move rook c1, okay, we go knight g6, and again, if they just bring their knight in, we bring the knight in, we go for the attack. But now they have this option of going c5. This has been played at a very top level very often. We're actually going to be following a game by Rajabov here, and the point is to then go b4. And if you bring the knight back, well, then after knight b5, you can't defend over c7. There's already too much pressure. So what you have to do after b4, because we're going to take this pawn, we're going to accept the pawn sack, you put the knight on a6. And from this position, the thing to understand is that the knight no longer helps and aids in our attack on the king side. And also, they've opened up the rook. They no longer have a pawn on c5, so they've opened up the bishop. So their attack is far stronger as well. And in exchange, of course, we have a pawn, but they do have compensation. So the way that you proceed in this position, and this is important, you want to play the move b6 at some point to stop their bishop and knight from connecting with a7. Then you're free to continue, you know, with your attack over here, but eventually, very soon, you want to play b6. Now, Rajabov in the game that we're following first did indeed play h5 and bishop d7, but then played b6. And again, this is an important move in such positions where you essentially stop the attacks from being so strong. Now, what you're going to notice here is that black goes about attacking in a very similar manner. They play rook to f7, they bring the rook into the game. There's ideas now of going g4, so g4 as white was played here in order to stop that. And in fact, this game, black had a great advantage here. It ended up churning out into a draw in the end, which I'll quickly show. But black was better here, and they were the ones that were pushing for more. The knight is attacked. If the knight moves, this is coming. There's some pressure along the G files and the H files and F files. So white ended up having to bail out with this nice, brilliant sacrifice here, which does guarantee a perpetual. But if you're, you know, fighting for a perpetual as white from an opening position, something went wrong. So this is the way that I recommend you play this sort of setup where they go for this pawn sacrifice. I don't think it would be so common for you to see this, but if you do see this, then b6 is the move to remember. Now let's go and back up completely, because this takes us now out of the bishop e3, bishop f2 setups, which are most common, and into the second most common setups that white has, which is knight e1, knight d3, and bishop d2 setups. Their idea with this sort of variation, as I hinted upon earlier, is to put some pressure on d6 and not commit so much and waste so much time moving the bishop to this more active diagonal. Now, we're going to continue from our standpoint in a very similar manner. f5. Right, and then we continue with knight to f6. We bring the knight back into the game. Now, this is also something important. You don't typically want to go f4 until they've committed with f3. There are some nuances, there are some possibilities for them. For example, g3 is possible in certain positions where, if we trade, then this sort of position tends to be good for white because they've relinquished a lot of the pressure that we have. So we want to close up the pressure. So we don't go f4 until they've committed with f3 because now they don't have the ability to go g3. Now, there is one more detail about this sort of setup that's important to note. Because the bishop doesn't end up on f2, that leaves the knight this f2 square, which is typically where it goes in these positions, and it ends up being a pretty serious defensive piece for white. So that's another strategy that white is going for, which is why f3 is something that you're going to see often, because this f2 square is valuable real estate. So either they place their bishop there, like we saw in the first main setup, or they're going to place their knight here as a defensive piece. We're going to continue regardless of what they play with g5. We're going, for this pressure on g4. The second they take, we're going to take back. And this is kind of what I was talking about. The knight comes here as a defensive piece, but ultimately white is still going for their attacking ideas. This is just a one move thing that sort of helps defend a little on the king side, but they're still going for this idea of knight b5, putting pressure here, maybe bishop b4 at some point. Now, therefore, we want to be as precise as possible in our attack, and we want to go for some of the same ideas I've already mentioned. So rook f7 here. There's a couple of other nice defensive moves that you're going to see in this game. There's the move knight e8 here, defending further over c7. We want to go a6 at some point and kick away this knight. There's also the move bishop d7, hitting the knight, in some cases threatening to take, because this bishop does have chances to sacrifice itself on h3, but aside from that, it's not a great piece. And bishop f8, this is the final move that's really, really thematic. In the previous games, you saw the bishop come to h6, which is a bit more of an active diagonal in view of the g4 move and, this diagonal opening up. But bishop f8 is sometimes necessary to defend a bit further over d6, but still give this rook the flexibility that it needs in order to be a successful attacking piece. So a nice move, bishop f8, very thematic. And what you're going to end up seeing in these positions, as you would expect, is white going for as much of an attack as they can come up with on the queen side. And we're going to continue here in very similar fashion, queen to g6, going for that kingside attack. And I think this game here in specific, which by the way, also Rajabov with the black side played in 2003, this goes to show the difference in the values of the attacks that we have. Black is going for checkmate. White, at the very most, is going to win a couple of pawns. Maybe an entire rook, maybe a full piece on the queen side. Oh no, wait a minute, we have checkmate here, right? After takes queen h2. So you can see the disparity in the attacks, where white's attack tends to not be so powerful. Again, at the very worst, we're losing a couple of pawns, maybe a bishop, maybe a rook. Now, in an endgame situation, that's terrible, we've lost the game. But in cases where we're successfully managing to effectively bring out an attack, that's meaningless because we're going to go for checkmate. And therefore, white, realizing this, decided in this position to go queen to b3, which they were justified to do. They had to retreat here in order to stop the attack, because otherwise, again, we had that mating idea. But now they give away a pawn, and knight to g3 here is a very nice idea. And now e4, and the attack just pours in. Admittedly, black did not go in the most effective manner about this attack, and in fact, they kind of lost their advantage for a little bit, but already through natural moves, black is much better here, and in fact, a nice sacrifice to end it off with king to f7, rook to h8 is a very unavoidable threat. We had knight to d6, the queen took, and now rook to h8, and indeed, black is insisting on infiltrating along h2, and here white resigned in view of the checkmate that is very soon to come. Now, the final thing that I want to cover, ladies and gentlemen, is a very rare but quite venomous sideline that white has, which is the move f3 here. Now, they're expecting us to go f5, which is what we're going for, and now they go g4. And now, what is this? This looks crazy in front of their king, especially because black is the one that attacks on the king side in such positions. Now, the main idea with the move g4, although it doesn't look like it, is actually to stop our attack. Here's the point. If we go f4, the very natural move, the move that we play in most positions in these structures, they now go h4. And it looks weird, but the point is very simple. Whenever we go g5, h5, and they lock up the position. Whenever we go h5, g5, they lock up the position, and so they're basically free to roam around on the queen side and go for as much pressure, and we cannot compete on the queen side. We just can't in the King's Indian. And so this would be, at least positionally or strategically, a big concession to make here. So what do I recommend that we play after g4? You also don't want to take, because although this is possible, you relinquish your attacking chances on the king side the second you open up the file, because now they have the defensive resources, the space basically around their king to defend from any attack, and therefore again the queen side is where the important game likely will be decided. So what do I recommend we do? Well, here's what I recommend. King h8. Now this is the idea. We're not going to take, as I showed, that's kind of bad. We're not going to push, as I showed, that's kind of bad. We're going to leave the tension. If they ever choose to take, because of the move king h8, we're going to take back, get a rook on the g file, and go for an attack. If they don't take, we're still going to use this g8 square, which is now free, for our knight to get into the game, either to f6, but usually this knight comes to f6. More common is bishop h6 or knight h6 and trade off pieces. And this is kind of how strategically we're going to play around the tension here until all of our pieces are in an optimal position to attack, to take, to win a pawn, to put significant pressure on this pawn structure over here. So let's go ahead and look how this plays out in practice. So we're going to be following a Rajabov game. First, what you're going to notice is he plays on the queen side to get a bit of space. And essentially, because white is going for some kingside play, it makes sense and we're justified in going for some queenside play, getting a little bit of stake on this side of the board so white doesn't frankly just run us over here. But ultimately, you'll see that black does go for this idea of knight g8. Now, you want to be careful in how you execute the idea of placing a piece here, because for one, sometimes it might not be possible with the queen. Sometimes it might not be possible because they're going to take this and then go g5 and fork two pieces. So there are tactical reasons why this won't work. And so what you're going to notice in this game, Rajabov decided it's not worth going and playing this move for the tactical reason I showed, and he brought the knight over to e7. I should note, actually, you could have gone knight h6 because this tactic doesn't work because of knight h5, a very nice detail, and now we bring the bishop back after the king moves, and then we're going to take and open up and we have an attack coming. So that would have actually been an improvement over what he played. But okay, he went for h5, also a very natural idea. You continue to open up the position when the time is right, and ultimately, a very nice tactic over here. He won some material on the queen side, playing around the whole board, and surprise, surprise, black ended up winning the entire game. So ladies and gentlemen, that is how you navigate the classical with knight e1. As a reminder, there are 3 setups that white can go for. The main one of playing f3 and bishop f2, the sideline of going knight d3, bishop d2, and knight f2, and the really weird sideline of going f3 and g4. And although there are nuances in these setups, the general gist of these sort of positions is that we break with f5, with f4, with g5, we go for an attack, and in the meantime, we very strategically defend over from the queenside attack that white is going for. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. As a reminder, PGN files, everything you need in the description below. Also, if you want to continue following along with this masterclass, we're going through every single variation of the King's Indian that you need to know. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.